Well, welcome, friends. We are glad that you're here today. It is Friend Day. If you didn't know that, we've only been talking about that for about 2 months now. But we are glad that you're here. Some of you have had a hard time finding friends to come today, though. I've heard a lot of you talk to me about this. Some of you say, well, all of my friends are already in church, or they're in another church. And several said, well, it's Memorial Day weekend. They're all out of town. And I know we may need to think through that a little bit. But we are still reaching out to friends. One fellow said to me, he said, Pastor, I'm having a hard time finding a friend. I think I'm just going to go on rentafriend.com. And I thought it was a joke, but I Googled it, and there is such a thing as rentafriend.com. Did you know that? For $10 an hour, you can have a friend. It says they'll introduce you to new people in town if you've just moved here, or if you need somebody to go see a movie with you, or to a ball game, or maybe you have to go to a wedding and you don't want to go alone, or some other family function, or to go to a museum. I think sometimes you have to rent a friend to go to museums with you. One of the interesting things it said was you could rent a friend to teach you manners. I thought that was interesting. But as I was looking through all that list of things that friends would do, it did say you could rent a friend to come to church with you. That's interesting. Well, if there's any renter friends this morning, we're glad you're here. But we're also glad to have the friends that came to be with their friends. Friendship can be difficult. It can be hard to find friends. It can be hard to keep friends. We have so many different ways to connect with people today, with Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or all the other things. And if it's something that you think you know as an adult, the kids have moved on, by the way. As soon as we know that platform, they keep moving on. There's all kinds of different ways to communicate. But even amidst all of this connectedness, we can feel lonely. We can have all kinds of connections, but what we really need is true friends. So what does it take to be a friend? Well, if you ask the three ladies that meet at Starbucks every Saturday morning, they tell you that common interest in good coffee and dedication to coming together are things that make for friendships. Or if you see a bunch of little 7-year-old boys together and ask them what makes friends, they might say, well, if you all like Spider-Man, you're friends. Or if you see a group of old Army buddies, it's their service they had together. But what if you don't like coffee, or you didn't like Spider-Man, or you didn't serve in the Army? What are our connections? Jesus gathered his disciples together in what is called the farewell discourse. He's saying goodbye to them. He's preparing to lay down his life for them. And he begins to talk about friendship. And he says to them, if you want to be my friend, then love one another. Jesus says that the secret of friendship is love. To care for each other above anything else. Or as your mama probably told you, to have a friend, you must be a friend. To reach out, to love. Jesus says to the disciples, I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I am now calling you friends, for everything that I have learned from the Father, I have made known to you. If you want to be a friend, you have to share your life together. Jesus has his disciples around, and they are really underlings. They have come to be under his tutelage. They have come to listen and to learn. It wasn't an even relationship. But now, as Jesus is preparing to say goodbye to them, he says, I no longer call you servants, but I am now calling you friends, for I am telling you everything you need to know, what has been made known to the Father, and I am sharing it all with you. Friends share with one another. We know each other's lives. I was trying to think of a sermon illustration to talk about this sharing with one another. And so I called my friend Matt. Matt and I have been friends for about 25 plus years, and he's a pastor. He's a Lutheran, by the way, but he's okay. He tells good stories. And I called Matt, and I said, Matt, I need an example of friends sharing with each other. Do you got a good story I can share? And Matt said, Nelson, I can't just come up with a story like that. I don't really have one right now. And I said, oh, that's all right. I said, how's your family doing? How are you doing? He said, well, I'm suffering from that empty nest syndrome. My oldest son is out of college now, and my youngest son is in college, and I'm really happy for them. They're doing really well, but we're just by ourselves, and we're used to having these kids around, and it's different. And my identity is tied up in fatherhood, and I don't really know what's next for me and for my wife. And you've been through this. Talk to me about this. And we talked for about 15 minutes, and as we got ready to hang up, Matt said, hey, you called me for a sermon illustration about friendship. Maybe this phone call was it. It wasn't really about a story. It was about listening to each other and caring for each other. The Greek word for this in the New Testament is koinonia. We translate it into English as fellowship, but fellowship doesn't really capture it. Koinonia is sharing our lives together, spending life together. Last week, we were talking about friendship here, and we had sang a lot of our friendship hymns, and James came in, and we were talking about what hymn could we sing at the end, and we weren't quite sure which one to sing, and I said, James, you'll find something. He said, yeah, I'll find it, and I looked in the program as we got together, and James had picked for our last hymn last week, the Servant Song. It was a great pick. It went right with what I was talking about, because it says, we are travelers on a journey, fellow pilgrims along the way. And then it has this wonderful phrase that says, I will hold the Christ light for you in the darkness of your fears. I will speak the peace you long to hear. That is what friends do. They share the journey of life. Whether it's a celebration that we call one another and we say something great has happened, or whether something tragic has happened and we call our friends together to just be together. A couple weeks ago, I got an email about my friend Larry Hovis. Larry's preached here before. He's the coordinator of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of North Carolina. The email was about a health scare that Larry has had. He was at Forsyth Hospital. He had a bad headache, and he'd gone to the doctor, and the doctor had sent him to the hospital for it was something more. His blood pressure had shot up, and he started having seizures. They had to induce a coma medically and see if they could control this. His brain was swelling, and it needed time to heal. His wife, Kim, was out in the hallway, and she was afraid. And the word was out, no one else come because the hospital's full, because they had so many people that cared about them. Kim said later on that there was another lady in the emergency room, and she looked at her with all of these dozens of people around her and said, you sure do have a lot of friends. And Kim said, well, my husband's a pastor, and he's a part of a group of Baptists. And these are our friends from church, and many churches have come together. This is what we do as a church. We are together, and we share our lives together. And you can be a part of that too. That's what friends do. They drop things. They come running. Friends will sacrifice for one another. As Jesus is speaking to his disciples, he's talking about the ultimate sacrifice that he is going to make of his life. He's going to die upon a cross. And Jesus says, greater love hath no one than this, that one will lay down his life for his friends. And he's preparing to do that. As we think about laying down our lives, we think about being there for one another. When we have our own priorities and yet our friends need us, we change our priorities. When I came to be your pastor about 4 years ago, William Barnard was the chair of the search team, and because he's chair of the search team, he got this thing in my mind, I guess, that he should be there when I need him, right? If he's bringing me here, then if I call him, he should come. And so I've been here about a week, And I remember I called William. I needed some help with something. And I said, William, what are you doing today? And this is what he said. He said, what do you need me to be doing today? What do you need me to be doing today? And I thought, no, that's a friend. Friends that when you call and you need help, they sacrifice whatever, and they come running. On this Memorial Day weekend, though, we think about those who sacrificed their own lives. You may or may not have heard of George Fox. George Fox was both a World War I and World War II veteran. He was 17 years old when World War I broke out. He was too young to serve, but he skipped off and he joined anyway. They made him a medical orderly. He was a corpsman. And while he was there serving others and helping those who were wounded, he felt a call to do more. He felt a call upon his life to give his life to Christ and to serve Christ as a pastor. So when the war was over, George Fox went to Moody Bible Institute, and then he went to Illinois Wesleyan University. He became a Methodist pastor. And then when World War II broke out, both he and his son enlisted on the same day. They sent George Fox to Harvard to chaplain school. There he met some other chaplains. He met Rabbi Alexander Good. Rabbi Good and George became good friends. He met Reverend Clark Poling, who was a Presbyterian pastor, and he met Father John Washington, a Catholic priest. On January in 1943, these four chaplains, along with 900 soldiers, boarded a ship, the SS Dorchester. They were to travel to England by way of Greenland. They had to go across the cold Atlantic, but that wasn't just the weather there in January. It was also that there were German U-boats. And along the way, U-223 spotted the convoy and torpedoed the ship. As the ship was sinking quickly, these four chaplains were assigned to make sure folks had life jackets. So they began to hand out the life jackets. And a young soldier came up to George Fox and said, I don't have a life jacket. He looked around and they were all gone. And so he took off his own life jacket and gave it to that soldier. The other three chaplains saw what he did, and they did the same thing, taking off their own life jackets and handing it to the men who were exiting the boat. As the ship went down, the four chaplains were on the deck, holding hands in a circle with others who could not get off, leading prayers as it went down. Not prayers for themselves, but prayers for the men who were out in the water, that they might be saved. These four chaplains were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and the Purple Heart posthumously. In 1960, Congress established a medal called the Four Chaplains Medal and awarded it to their families. They gave their own life in the ultimate sacrifice to those who were in need. You see, friends not only share, friends also sacrifice whatever it takes. But there's one more thing. Friends stick together. They stay with one another. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, if you love me, then love one another. He's wanting them to be together as disciples. Proverbs 18:24 says, one who has unreliable friends soon will come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. There are those who are around us who will hold on to us in the most difficult of times. There's a group of 14 men who get together once a year for a reunion. They call themselves the Cavalry. Now, Cavalry is not a real word, is it? It's a made-up word. It's the Calvary and family. They put it together because they served in Vietnam together in the Calvary. And yet they became family. After they came home, they went their different ways, but life came upon them, and it was difficult. And so one of these men, Terry Bradley, wrote a letter. He wrote to the others he had served with. They had been in the Calvary, but they were in charge of keeping the roads so that the equipment might keep going. And there in Vietnam, they said half the year it was too wet and rained. The other half of the year it was too dry and wouldn't rain at all. And it was a difficult job. And while they were out, they were often set upon by the enemy. They were there together, however. They formed these tight friendships. And while they were back here in the States, they had other needs. And so Terry wrote to his friends and said, let's get together. Let's be there for one another, not just where we served, but here and now. And so every year now they get together and they share their lives. They talk about those hardships that have happened, and they talk about the celebrations that have happened, the grandkids that have been born. They stick together. For they needed each other then and they need each other now. Jesus wanted these disciples to stick with him. We know the story. They didn't do it very well, did they? As they came, they arrested Jesus shortly after this conversation. Disciples scattered and went every which way. All but Peter. He tried to follow, but you know the story. As he got closer and closer and people identified him, he said, I don't even know who that is. And he denied Jesus. After Jesus came back to life and arose, he came back to these disciples and he called them together. You remember the story, how they had gone back to fishing, and Jesus came along the shore and he cooked some fish and made them breakfast. And he called them back out of the boats and he called them around the table. And he blessed them. He took Peter aside and said, Peter, Peter, if you love me, feed my sheep. Do what I've asked. Come back and do the job I've given to you. And Peter said, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And he gathered those other disciples together, and they stuck together, and they began Christ's church. Scripture says they turned the world upside down. When we stick together, we can do great things for our friend Jesus. You know, Jesus is our greatest friend, a friend like no other. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor when Hitler came to reign. He started an underground seminary. He started training other pastors. Most of the churches just ignored Hitler. They thought, well, it will go away. We'll just go along and get along. But not Bonhoeffer. He spoke out against what was going on, and so he was jailed. He was eventually sent to a concentration camp. You know that he wrote that wonderful book, The Cost of Discipleship, that talks about what it really means to be a Christian. But he also wrote another book that I love called Life Together. It talks about how we as a church are friends when we come together around Christ. He begins by reminding us of Psalm 133:1 that says, behold how good and how pleasant it is when brothers and sisters dwell together in unity. Bonhoeffer talks about the church coming together as a blessed community of love. It reminds me of these words of Jesus that says, if you love me, love one another. We are so different, and yet we come together to be one. When we come together here, we come from different walks of life, different ways of thinking, different political parties. We come together, and what brings us and unites us is that we come together to worship Christ. Sometimes I get this vision in my head. I see hundreds of people scattered around, but all looking in the same direction. They're all different. They might not even like each other, but they're looking at something. And as I find myself in this vision, I know what they're looking at. It's the cross. And then as we all begin to walk towards the cross, guess what happens? The closer everyone walks towards Christ, the closer we get to each other. That is Christ's vision for the church. Jesus says, if I be lifted up, I will draw all people to me. How do we truly become friends? It's hard to do it on our own. Jesus says, you love me, you will love one another. So the way that we are friends with each other is that we become friends first with Christ. And the closer we draw to Christ, the closer we will be to each other.